Hello, everybody. Welcome. Got lots of people coming in. Excellent. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Get a lot of people coming in. Great. We might just wait for another minute, see if we can get a few more people in. Awesome. Everyone's coming in. Okay, to stick to time today, just hands up from Erin. You can hear me okay? Nice and clear. Yep. Great. Cool. I might just make a start so we can stick to time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Firstly, we'd love to hear where you're from. So maybe if you can just jump in the chat box and just let us know where you're calling in from today, and maybe even just change your name and rename your Zoom link there if you like. But yeah, we'd love to know what country you're calling in and what part of Australia you're calling in from. Thanks so much. I am Fiona Blanford. I'm the community organiser here at BirdLife Australia. You've all been hearing lots from me, lots of emails from me in the last couple of days. Just making sure everyone has all the details they need to be calling in. I'm looking at you down there. I'm on a laptop today, so I'm just kind of like juggling two documents here. So if I look down, that's because I'm looking at you, not up. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining us today to join us in protecting the Swift Parrot and this really valuable habitat on the south coast of New South Wales. Many of you joined us back in May for our webinar when we were calling you to action to help us fight to protect the Swift Parrot again, but that time was for our Nature Laws campaign, which is still running. And if you want to check out what's happening there, please jump on the actforbirds.org.au website. That's still a very live campaign, as many of you will know. So we've come back to you today because the Swift Parrot habitat is in trouble again on the south coast. We've planned to resume pre-forestry operations and also some active logging that's going on in compartments in the South Brooman and Bogo State Forest, which sits in with the Ulladulla to Merimbula KBA, which is an internationally recognised area for its significance to the species. Yeah, there's some stuff going on there that you'll be hearing from later from one of our locals who've got on the call today. So we know that a lot of you who are calling in from the south coast that you're still recovering from the fires. We know there's been a massive impact on the community there, as there have been in other parts of Australia. But and we know that it's been a really tough time for all of you. Look, and there's also been devastating for our wildlife in the area also. We're calling you back today because we want to let you know that BirdLife Australia is calling for an immediate and permanent end to forestry operations within known and potential habitat for the critically endangered Swift Parrot. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge our traditional owners of country throughout Australia and also recognise their continuing connection to land, borders and culture, but also like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we would like to acknowledge here at BirdLife that Aboriginal land, sorry, just had a wobble there. I would like to acknowledge here that Aboriginal land always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and also that sovereignty was never ceded. We're honoured that so many of you could join us here today. We understand everyone is really busy. It's a Friday, of course, but we know everyone's really busy, and it's been a really intense time for all of us here in 2020. Thankfully now lots of restrictions are easing around the country, especially for us here in the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. And but we just please caution everyone, continue to be careful. So a bit of just housekeeping. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to our team online today who are helping to run the webinar. We've got Erin Farley, who's our head of campaigns. Hey Erin, how you going? We've also got Andrew Hunter on the line, who's our conservation campaigner. And we also have Chris Timewell, who's online from our Woodland Bird team, who'll be helping out in the chat box today. Now we have our chat box open on the side. I sent an email earlier to call out for any questions. We've got a lot of people on the line today. We had over 300 regos, which is just fantastic. So if we don't get to all your questions today, we will follow up in a follow-up email. But please use the chat box, jump in at any time with questions that come to mind. We've got two moderators, both Erin and Chris, in there today. We are recording, so if you have to jump off early, just head over to the BirdLife YouTube channel it'll be there in the next couple of days. Everyone is on mute, but we would love you to keep your video on. We feel like it's just, this real sense of community when we can actually see everyone, and we're all also very connected to each other and we can see each other. Awesome. So we've organised a panel of experts and locals to talk to you today about the Swift Parrot and what's going on with the Swift Parrot presently. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Deb Saunders, who's joined us. Deb is a conservation ecologist and researcher at the Fenner School at ANU there, and Deb is also the author of a highly regarded report that came out last year and in August 2019 on the importance of critically endangered Swift Parrot habitat on the south coast of New South Wales. Hey Deb, how you going? Cool. And we've also got Mick on the line. Mick is our New South Wales Woodland Bird Program Manager. Mick is calling in from Newcastle. Thanks so much for joining us, Mick. Wait. Hey. We've also got Jocelyn Vandermeulen, who is a forest campaigner and Southern New South Wales Coast local, and also with the Coast Watchers Association Forest Working Group. Hey Jocelyn, how are you? And we also have Dr. Oisin Sweeney, who's from our BirdLife Shoalhaven branch, and also an ecologist there on our committee. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us and everyone who's called in today. Today the webinar is going to be broken into 3 sections. We're going to be hearing from Deb and Mick first on Swift Parrot and its habitat. Then we're going to move over to hear from Jocelyn and Oisin from living in the region, what's going on in the region. And then we're going to hear from the campaigns team a little bit about our call to action and workshop we're coming up on the 17th. So let's kick off. Deb, I'd love to call you to the stage. Can you tell us a little bit about your awesome work and also why the South Coast is so important to Swifties?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's wonderful to have a group of people here today that are passionate about making a difference, and I feel like the time has come. I've been working on the Swift Parrot for about 20 years or more, and my first job was to figure out where they were going and what they were doing in New South Wales. In that time, I was involved in the volunteer program, etc., in actually getting that up and running, and we've discovered some really important places across the state of New South Wales, but as well more broadly, and BirdLife has been a key player throughout the whole time across the species range. But what my research focused on was in New South Wales. When they weren't in Victoria, where were they going? And together with hundreds of volunteers, we were able to shed light on key regions that this species really depended on. They're amazing birds, they're really dynamic, they move in different places at different times. But one thing we do know about them is that they will go back to the same places and even the same trees again and again. And it can be decades, it can be a couple of years, or it could be year after year, depending on the food that is available. Now, there's lots of information out there to show just how important the South Coast is, as well as other areas. The Riverina is also important, right up the coast, right up the inland areas, and even in the ACT, they also regularly occur now. From our early research, there was certainly inundations to coastal areas during drought, which was massive, where the whole population will shift 1,000 kilometres or so further north. But what has become more apparent since I did my PhD research, which highlighted those sorts of things, is that our climate is changing, and these birds need to respond on an annual basis in order to survive. And they're the lucky ones in a way, because they actually can adapt and move. And what's happening is that the flowering cycles of their food are changing. And when I first started working in the forest on the South Coast, whenever I spoke to a local person, they would say that the spotted gum flowers every 7 years or so. What seems to be happening now, if you look at the records of the birds, is that's actually now every 2 or 3 years. That's a dramatic change in resource availability. It's not just swift parrots, the flying foxes have moved into Bateman's Bay. All these other animals, they know that this is where the resources are. So this area now is getting larger numbers of swift parrots than ever before, and more frequently. So it was already important, the area, for the species, but over time it's becoming more and more so. There's climate modelling from the New South Wales government that shows the importance of the South Coast. BirdLife has documents that indicate, you know, there's important bird area down there. There is no doubt that this is really, really important. And we all know what happened last summer with the fires, and what is remaining there is going to be crucial for quite some time before those trees are actually able to flower again. So it's just, you know, I've organised a meeting to meet with the Minister as well to talk about this. I did produce a report as part of a conservation project I have for Swift Parrots with the Environmental Trust. There's lots of documents that show it. So there's no lack of evidence that this is important. But it seems that actually getting the evidence of what is going on in the management of these forests is not so clear. And I think that's what this campaign and all of you who are present today really is a fantastic opportunity. It's the best opportunity I've seen in 20 odd years to make a difference where there is some political will. There's people on the ground who care and want to make a difference. And I just hope that I can help facilitate your involvement and support you in whatever way I can. I think I'll leave it there because otherwise I'll take up too much time.
That's great. Thank you so much, Deb. I think it's a good time to bring Mick in. I'm sure Mick's probably got some questions for you too, so it'd be great to hear from both of you. Thanks, Deb.
Yeah, I guess, you know, really I just wanted to reiterate what Deb has said. And Fee, maybe if you could bring up a couple of those maps in the PowerPoint, I can just sort of point out the main thing that BirdLife does on the mainland outside of campaigns, and that's actually collating records of Swift Parrots when they're on the mainland. So just for some quick context, Swift Parrots only breed in Tasmania. And so in autumn, winter, they migrate back to the mainland. So any migratory species does live a pretty high risk lifestyle. Sedentary birds are kind of stuck in the one patch, but species that migrate, you know, they actually cover 2 types of habitat, or maybe 3 or 4 types of habitat during the year. So, as Deb mentioned, I think Deb was instrumental in sort of kicking off this annual data collection. So over the years, you know, since '98, we've been collecting just about every Swift Parrot record, as many Swift Parrot records as we can on the mainland every year. And by doing that, we can actually see the difference in the landscapes, difference in habitats that the birds are using. So if you can just go to the next one. So what's become obvious from collecting all of this data is that the South Coast is definitely one of the most consistent places where birds will go. But it's not just about the consistency. There are a few places, in fact, if any, that can rival the Swift Parrots, rival the South Coast for the sheer numbers of Swift Parrots. And a good example is in 2012, when we had a single roosting flock of 1,200 Swift Parrots. That was, you know, around about half or maybe even over half the entire population in one patch. 2014, there were another 700 there, and prior to that in 2009, 350 Swift Parrots are using these forests. So it's not just about the consistency, it's also about the sheer number of birds. And with some migratory species, like shorebirds, where they return to the same estuary, Swift Parrots generally, you know, they don't necessarily want to go, you know, as far north every year if conditions are good. And so if conditions are good in the South Coast forest, then presumably that's where the birds will like to winter. So if we go to the next slide that I've got there, just to give some context about this year. So, you know, I don't want to speculate too much about why this is, but one of the things that's become pretty apparent about the 2020 Swift Parrot sightings database is the lack of flocks. You know, we've had a lot of records. You can see that it's mostly small dots there. We've had a lot of records of less than 10 birds, very few records of anything more than 25 birds, and literally just the one record of more than 50 birds. So, you know, it's impossible to try and explain why that is. Long-term data sets give us this information. But
I want to jump in there, Mick. Sorry. Yeah, I don't think it's impossible to say why that is. I think it's because they're declining, and they're declining dramatically. And I find this actually really disturbing, because one thing we know about this bird is that they're very social. And the only way they can survive is by getting together. They come to these communal roosts where they get hundreds of birds together, is a natural congregation for this species. They might forage in smaller flocks. But without those big congregations, they're actually losing the capacity to find the resources that they need across the landscape. So that's really quite alarming that we're seeing that already.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing the same thing with regent honeyeaters, which are normally a flocking bird. Now we're just getting loads of records of single birds. It's like you say, Deb, it's actually quite scary. As the population falls, that becomes the main threat to the species, is the critically low population and the inability for them to actually operate the way that they would normally have in flocks, as you say. And I just wanted to...
Sorry, and Mick and Deb, just for context, could you just tell everyone what would the estimated size of the population is now? I guess just to give some context of like what the size of those flocks mean.
Well, Deb might want to expand on this, but generally speaking, you know, in the recovery plan, it's around 2,000 birds, but the recovery plan is a little bit outdated, and recent research, which hasn't been published yet, is showing that the population is probably much less than that. So I guess the point is that it is still a declining population, and with the threats that swifties are facing in Tasmania, I'm sure that most people would have seen the stuff in the media about sugar gliders entering nesting hollows. You know, these birds are facing all sorts of challenges on their breeding grounds, but also challenges on the mainland, which is what we're talking about today with the loss of wintering habitat. So who knows? It's potentially less than 1,000 birds as we speak. But Deb, I don't know if there's any...
the latest figures are actually even more scary than what you can imagine. The flock sizes that Mick is talking about from 2012 is more than what now is in existence globally. So when you think about that, it is chilling that in terms of the genetics of the population, very, very small. We're talking genetic viability of several hundreds birds.
Yeah, it's only 8 years ago too. So
not that long ago.
Yeah.
And I wrote to the minister recently and I said, you know, this species is destined to go extinct before my kids finish school.
Yeah.
And it's preventable. It's completely preventable, and it's been driven by government policy that keeps approving the clearance of habitat. And we know what it needs, we know where it goes, what needs to happen, but there's not been the will and the push to actually make that become a reality. The extinction is not inevitable for this species. It is adaptable and it can recover if we allow it to, by retaining habitat and expanding habitat.
Yeah. Thanks, Deb. And I will just make one more point for you. If we could just flick to the next slide. Even though that, you know, the Swift Parrots definitely will gravitate to the heavily flowering trees, I just wanted to point out that the birds will still gravitate to the South Coast even when there isn't blossom. The Swift Parrots are quite fond of a thing called lerp, and that little image there on the left, you can just make out a little sort of pinkish tinge under that white sort of triangle looking thing. That's a psyllid, and the psyllid makes this sugary coating over the top of them, like an umbrella to protect them. And that lerp, that white stuff, is actually high in sugar content, and birds like swifties just go nuts over lerp. So it's not just about, the spotted gums flower every however many years. The birds are still going back to the South Coast forest to feed on this lerp, and it's actually called spotted gum lerp psyllid. So yeah, I guess what the point to take home really is that it is the mature spotted gum forests of the South Coast that are critically important to this bird on the mainland. Blossom is fantastic, but they will go there anyway to feed on lerp as well. So yeah, so I might that might do it from me, I think.
Mick, did you want to talk at all to the KBA map?
Yeah. Okay. So BirdLife run a key biodiversity area program, which is an international program that outlines areas that are critically and vitally important to not just threatened species, but congregations of waterbirds. But on the south coast, there is a key biodiversity area, Merimbula up to Ulladulla. And that, although that map is hard to see, there's actually, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse there, but the KBA boundary hugs the south coast, and those blue crosses are Swift Parrot records. So the area is actually littered with Swift Parrot records over a period of time. And there is also shown on that map the fire extent of last year's fires. So there's a major overlap between where these areas were burnt and where Swift Parrots have been recorded within the key biodiversity area in the past. And of course, thinking in the short term, because we're the critically endangered species, it's things that happen in the short term that matter. You know, we have to think short term to try and get this bird off the the road to extinction. So what that means is that it is the unburnt forests on the south coast that are now even more important for Swift Parrots.
We have this map also that came out of our KBA report that came out recently this year. I just thought it was worth putting this in here also. Nick, did you or Andrew want to speak to this map at all?
Andrew?
Yeah, no worries. I can talk to that. This is Andrew from the campaigns team. So this map came from analysis that BirdLife Australia did on the fire impacts to KBAs across the country, and the Ulladulla and Merimbula KBA there on the south coast of New South Wales was one of the most heavily impacted KBAs. And it's kind of hard to see in this map, but the early analysis shows that over a third of the KBA was impacted by the fires in some way. But if you just want to go back to that previous map too, because I think there's an important point. So there's also an overlay here of potential logging areas. These are areas that are currently on the logging schedule or could potentially be on the logging schedule in the next few years. And you can see they're right in with that fire extent and within the key biodiversity area for Swift Parrots. So protecting the remaining unburnt habitat is critical, as Mick was saying, for the future of the species.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Thanks both Deb and Mick. Have we got any questions that have come through on the chat box, Erin, that we wanted to pull forward now?
There were just a couple. I said Chris, who's also part of the Woodland Birds team with BirdLife, has just jumped in and answered the question about cultivating lerps. Not sure if anyone else had any other questions. We're also answering some of them in the chat here. Yeah, I think I just wanted to, Oisin has put in a great comment about how Swift Parrots are really the best example, the best or the worst example of how our nature laws at a state and federal level aren't protecting our wildlife.
Yeah, that's right. I guess, you know, you would assume that the listing of critically endangered would make some difference, but it doesn't seem to have.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, guys. I might bring in Jocelyn now from the South Coast there. Jocelyn, I'll just pull up your slides.
Hi everyone, I'm from Coast Watch's Forest Working Group, and I'll just acknowledge that Nick Hopkins is also here at this webinar, and we group Friends of the Forest Mogo, when we found out about, or really realised the local logging in our area 4 years ago. And I guess we're also working in with a much more established group, and we've got Harriet Swift here who spoke at the last webinar, and also Sean Burke, just their work with the Southeast Regional Conservation Alliance, because it's so important to work together. So on that last map, we had the key biodiversity area of Ulladulla down to Merimbula, which is on the south coast of New South Wales. Ulladulla is about 3 hours south of Sydney. So if we just go to the next slide, Fiona. So what I've got here is a little what I'm going to do is illustrate that map that Andrew was talking about, where we've got the fire and the logging and the swift parrots all in the one area. So this is a little screen grab from the forestry portal. So you can go onto the forestry website at any time and see where local logging is in your area, which I really encourage the community to do. And so it's basically showing all of those little coloured blobs planned logging. So there's about 13 compartments planned to be logged. So this is between Ulladulla and Batemans Bay, an area of about, I'm just guessing, but 45 kilometres. You've got the Princes Highway going there in grey. And so the state forest stretches from Ulladulla all the way to the Victorian border, mainly west of the Princes Highway, a little bit on the east, and you just get intensive logging. There's 1 million hectares of logging, 20,000 hectares a year, which is 200,000 hectares in 10 years. So the logging was interrupted during the fires from November to March, and in March it just resumed. The purple spot there has it was interrupted in November and they started again in March. So there was no change to the schedule. They've then moved on to the green area. The light blue areas are planned, and the yellow, well, the light blue are scheduled and the yellow are planned. So this is of great concern to the locals who live on the Clyde River north of Neligan, that have been through the bushfires twice and also flooding. And now they're dealing with not only logging trucks, but extreme concern about the remaining wildlife. So if you don't mind, the next slide. See? And although some of the area has been scorched, particularly if you drive from Canberra to Batemans Bay, the whole mountain sides and valleys just completely toasted. In this area where the logging has been just resumed, there's actually quite a lot of unburnt creek lines with surviving wildlife. And so I find this really shocking that the logging schedule hasn't been changed to accommodate the fact that within the 13 million burnt hectares, that there's actually areas with surviving wildlife. So, so Forestry PR talks about salvage logging, but they're actually talking about logging of pine plantations. People don't realise that live trees are being cut down, and it's of course mainly for wood chip and firewood. And I'll go on to the next slide, but I'll just stay here for the moment with these pictures, because the one thing the EPA did do with logging resuming after the bushfires was they put in some specific conditions, and one of them was to retain trees with hollows, hollows that were visible from the ground. But there we have a photo of the hollow of a live tree that was cut down. It actually was a giant tree as well, over 1.4 in diameter across. So this photo was one of almost 100 trees reported to the EPA, which led to a stop work order. So immediately, the fight is on. So the next slide, please, B. So I've just sort of listed these bushfire affected operation conditions because forestry, so the EPA have said, okay, the forest has been burnt, but there are some unburnt areas, so we've got some rules. We're not going to log the unburned areas. We're going to retain all the trees with hollows, and we're going to have extra buffers on the habitat features. Creek lines, rainforests, threatened ecological communities, they're not logged and they have a buffer next to them. But since September, October, on the EPA website, you can see letters from Forestry, the EPA, and Forestry have informed EPA that they're not going to apply these bushfire conditions anymore. And I just say, well, the leaves may have grown back, but the wildlife numbers are still decimated. We still need all our trees with hollows because wildlife is going to take, decades for the numbers to recover, and we need the extra buffer areas. So with the call to action, as well as stopping logging, in the immediate future, forestry just cannot go ahead without, having these EPA conditions. And then I've just got one more slide with a PS about Swift Parrot tree protections. So Fee, just the next slide. When when people spot swift parrots and record them on the EPA Bionet, forestry, when they start looking at logging an area, they're meant to look at all the threatened species records and then trigger particular protections. But of course, they're not necessarily applied. So in Bogo, Nick and I were looking at some logging, and we had a BirdLife Australia member do a digital search and found all these swift parrot records from 2012, and that triggered extra trees being protected, which, you know, the compartment was active, they were cutting trees down, and they had to go in, the technician, and spray paint an N on an extra 5 trees per hectare, which doesn't sound like much, but when you've got 200 hectares being logged, that saves, you know, theoretically 1,000 trees. So recording your sightings on the digital atlas is a key conservation outcome. And there's the list of trees that forestry allocators need to feed trees, but often they're the skinny little trees, but of course they need to be the big ones that have a lot of blossom. So that covers what I was going to talk about, Fiona.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I had a question for you first up that I missed, but it's been great hearing all of this. Thank you. And hello to Harriet out there. I can't really see who's on the line. I've got too much going on here, but it's great that we've got some people calling in from Circle also, and Nick is calling as well. I was just going to ask, like, obviously there's been numerous amounts of stress in the community this year and during the fires and pre the fires, but how has it brought the community together? You mentioned the alliance, that not few alliances that have formed on the coast that existed before, but what's it been like for the community? How does the community feel about this? How has it brought people together or divided, or, you know, what's going on there for you?
Well, of course, wires immediately went out after the fires because it was still extremely hot and in drought conditions, and there was this whole network of wildlife feed and watering stations. Also in South Brooman, between Ulladulla and Batemans Bay, the locals formed a Brooman State Forest Conservation Group to get together, and then we saw their Facebook page and met them and explained to them about citizen science and the need for forestry to be compliant and as a way to get conservation measures. Also in the Shoalhaven, a new group is formed called Our Future Shoalhaven, which is an alliance of all the little groups in the area. And I know that universities are also doing a lot of research to ground truth the fire severity maps. So, you know, people are looking at satellite mapping of fire severity and then going in the field and with apps and taking photos and ground truthing that. So a lot of citizen science.
That's really awesome to hear. And I think, you know, we're, as an organisation, so happy to be here that we can support the locals and, you know, bring our teams to just save these forests. Like, it just should not be happening. Anyway, I might bring in Oisin here from BirdLife Shoalhaven. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. That's really great to hear what's happening at that level. And yeah, thank you for all your work that you're doing in the area. So Oisin, I might just bring you in now. Shoalhaven being a mecca for birds, as we know, but also one area that was probably spared compared to some of the other areas surrounding you when it came to the fires. I mean, it got pretty close, but there's some pockets in there that were spared. What's the Shoalhaven branch, BirdLife Shoalhaven branch, been up to in the last 6 months? I know there's been a lot of recovery work. I'm going to share your Shoalhaven newsletter after the webinar. There's an amazing overview there, but yeah, what's been going on?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona, and hi everybody. Lovely to hear so many passionate people and to touch base, at least electronically, with so many of you that I know. So our branch, and I must confess, I'm probably a bit of an imposter on this call. Our very capable conservation officer is a man called Chris Grimes, who's away at the moment. So I'm stepping in on behalf of our branch. Now, the main thing that our branch has been up to, I guess there's a few things relevant to the Swift Parrot campaign. Jocelyn's presentation was very interesting there, and particularly in the context of South Brooman. So when you asked your question, Fiona, about how has the logging brought people together or split people apart, it's very interesting to note, for those of you that didn't already know, that a motion was put to Shoalhaven Council to write to Minister Keane and to our local member, Shelley Hancock, expressing concern about Brooman logging. But unfortunately, a group of councillors banded together to actually block any discussion on the motion, let alone writing to those members of Parliament. So that's just an interesting observation about the functioning of the Shoalhavens Council. Now, the main project that we're involved in at the moment is the post-fire research, bushfire research monitoring project. So that's being run through BirdLife Shoalhavens Committee, in particular with Rob Dunn and Gary Daly, who's done a really great job. There have been literally hundreds of surveys done now with a whole squadron of volunteers, and it's grown from quite a small project into something that is contributing quite a lot of data now, which is going into the bird data app. We're delighted that we've managed to rope in Chris Grounds, who is an ANU researcher who works with Professor Lindenmeyer's team. He works in Booree National Park, surveying primarily mammals and post-fire monitoring, long-term post-fire monitoring in Booree. And Chris is going to cast his eye over that data as well to help make sure that the volunteers are collecting data that's going to be useful in the long term. So that's really exciting and very generous of Chris to give us his time. So, you know, I guess as a small group of volunteers, that's really sucking up the majority of the branch's time and energy. Couple of other relevant things though. I think I spoke to the previous webinar on the issue of Manana and the proposal to develop one of the last unburnt patches of forest down in that area. That's still up in the air with no final decision, but BirdLife Shoalhaven has supported Manana Matters in their campaign to protect that bit of bushland where we can. And the other relevant thing, and it's both supporting the head office campaign for the Swift Parrot, but also a response to the logging in South Brooman, that our committee has resolved to write to Minister Keane and Shelley Hancock, supporting BirdLife Australia's position on an end to native forest logging in all Swift Parrot habitat. So that's probably they're the main things that we've been involved in relevant to the Swift Parrot campaign. So yeah, if there's any questions, or if anyone wants to get involved in the local area in BirdLife Shoalhaven, please get in touch. We're always looking for more volunteers to undertake the post-fire habitat surveys, for example.
Thank you. Thanks, Oisin. So which, like you're obviously doing a lot of work in the Shoalhaven, but how far is the group working outside of the Shoalhaven? Like I know you've got a few KBAs quite close to you in the Shoalhaven, but how far have you been reaching out? Like I know we don't have a lot of people on the ground.
No, it's a good question. I'm not entirely sure where the most distant survey has taken place. The majority of them are within the Shoalhaven and South Coast area. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure exactly how far people have pushed in.
Yeah, that was just a shock for me to a brain spark to see what was happening there. Thank you so much. Like as one of our very active branches, we're so happy that you're doing the work you're doing, and also know that it's been hard for a lot of you there, not just through the fires, but obviously COVID has hit everyone in the region immediately after the fire. So there's really been no time to, take a breath. Although, you could be in Melbourne, so not wanting to compare, but thankfully you've still got some beautiful patches there that you know you can spend some time in. But there's some work to be done to protect those forests. Have we got a few questions? Sorry, Oisin?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's definitely more work to do, but it has been a roller coaster year for everyone. But as you say, I think we around here are probably some of the more lucky people in regards to the impact of COVID on general lifestyle.
Yeah, it's kind of like a tipping scale, isn't it? It's like what's just happened to the fires, you know, after the fires, the impact of the fires, which, you know, I know there's still some people doing it really tough there. So, and then COVID on top of that. So, yeah, it's been I don't want to use the word that we've been using so often for the last year, the unprecedented word, but it really has been one of those years. So do we have some questions that have come through in the chat box, Erin or Chris, that we want to ask anyone before we move into our call to action?
I think Chris has been doing a pretty good job at posting some comments. Chris, I don't know if you want to just quickly go over. So a few folk were asking questions about where the Swift Parrots are, and Chris has also posted a link to our Swift Parrot identification guide. Yeah, is there anything else that that anyone had a question about? Oh, and Harriet's just asked, which stringy bark do they prefer? So that's one for Chris or Mick or Deb, I guess.
It's a difficult one. Stringy barks are very hard to identify, but overall, stringy barks, generally speaking, are really great nectar producers. Speaking from recent experience, up here in the Hunter and in the Hawkesbury, we've had virtually no eucalypt blossom this year, so it's been a very tough year for regent honeyeaters, but we've had at least 3 nests of birds, and they were feeding on a tree called a thin-leaved stringy bark, Eucalyptus eugenoides. So I can tell you that that's definitely an important stringy bark, but I would imagine that other stringy barks also, because they have a very large globular flower mass. So yeah, stringy barks overall are really great habitat trees for nectar feeders.
Great, thanks, Nick.
Thanks. And I see there's another person's just asked for a list of their favourite trees. So we could potentially put that information in our follow-up email that everyone will be getting.
Yeah, there is actually a small list of the most important trees in that guide that Chris has put a link to. And it's also worth pointing out, so last year, BirdLife put together a Regent Honeyeater booklet, which is about it's like a magazine format. The way that I describe it as the recovery plan in a magazine, easy to read, lots of photos, and explains exactly the stuff that we're doing to try and save Regent Honeyeaters. As we speak, we're actually putting together the same thing for Swift Parrots. So hopefully by early next year, there'll be a nice glossy magazine full of all of this information out there, and it includes line drawings of the fruits and the flowers of all of these important gum trees as well. So stay tuned for that one.
Thanks, Mick. I can see Deb Saunders is just jumping off. Thanks so much for joining us, Deb, if you're still on the remnants of being here. We'll catch up with you later. Thank you for that. Any other questions, Erin or Chris, that we want to pull forward? So it's been quite active in there. No, cool. All right, so thank you both from hearing what's happening, the importance of that habitat along the south coast there, and great to always just hear a bit of info about the Swift parrot and its behaviours. And I think I note that Jocelyn has a pretty good list of some of the nectar feed trees that are in that area also, so we can pull something together afterwards. I might just hand it over to Erin and Andrew. What can we do? What can we do to save these forests? And maybe let us know a little bit about our call to action today.
Sure. So I can see there's been a lot of comments in the chat box about the EPA, and sort of that's come up with some of the things folk have been talking about as well. Yeah, I invite Jocelyn or Nick if you want to jump in with any other clarifying points. But as everyone's discussed, obviously, the Swift Parrot's in a really it's a really important point in time. We really need to act. The bird is on a trajectory to extinction if we can't protect its habitat. And that means ending native forest logging in New South Wales and in Tasmania. And for those who have joined previous webinars, we are also working on protecting breeding habitat in Tassie. But in New South Wales, it's gotten to the point where I know, it's not just BirdLife and other forest activists that are talking about stopping this logging. The EPA has made really quite an unusual move to publicly call out what the New South Wales Forestry Corporation are doing in light of their logging. So the EPA has basically, they've published all of this information on their website. A lot of you are probably aware, but their position is that a return to operating under the regional forestry agreement equivalent for New South Wales that affects Swift Parrots is untenable. So that is really a very strong move from them to say, really publicly call out what Forestry Corporation are doing. We met with the EPA a few weeks ago, and it was very clear that there's a number of things that we need to do, and citizen science is a really important one. But the other really important action we can take is to increase pressure on the political representatives who will actually be making the decision about whether native forest logging continues in Swift Parrot habitat. So that means correspondence and contact with your state representatives and the relevant ministers who make decisions about this, because when it comes to particularly this issue of logging in burnt areas and to protect Swift Parrot habitat, it's going to be a political decision at a government level. It's not going to be one that's implemented by either the EPA or the Forestry Corporation. Is essentially what the EPA said to us. So from today, what we'd really love for you to do, and Andrew's going to go over this a bit more, is get in contact with your state representatives. Andrew, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sure. And I'll just also point out, I think I saw in the chat, Oisin and I think Harriet mentioned that those provisions in the rules that do allow forestry operations to continue in native habitat are just not adequate at this stage to protect and conserve a critically endangered species like the Swift Parrot. So I just wanted to point that out, that's one of the key reasons both the bird is critically endangered, but also the rules that are there to protect them just aren't working at this stage. And really it's we're thankful that we do have groups like Jocelyn and Nick and the other groups, Forestry Watchers and Coast Watchers, that are out there on the ground. They're being the eyes and ears for Swift Parrots while they're down in Tasmania for the summer, just to make sure that the rules that are in place are being followed, and they're alerting the EPA about that. But the one thing I guess that everyone can do today as a first step, as Aaron was saying, is to put that political pressure at the local level. So we've set up a fairly easy call to action. If you just follow this link, and we'll pop it in the chat box and send it through in follow-up emails. But basically it's a form letter that you can personalize, and we definitely recommend that you personalize the body of the email going to your state MP with why this issue is so important to you, and why you care about Swift Parrots and why we need to act now. So if you follow that link and you complete the form, you should pop in your postcode, and it will auto-populate your New South Wales State Member of Parliament, and it'll send this letter to them. urging them to call on Forestry Corporation and those two key decision makers, the Minister for Environment and Minister for Industry and Trade, to stop all forestry operations within Swift Parrot habitat. So please, definitely take this action today. Share it with your friends, family, put it on social media if you're active on social media. The more voices we have in this campaign, the more power we have, and certainly we'll be back, coming back to you with more ways that you can influence local elected representatives to put power on those, to put pressure on those key decision makers over the next coming weeks. So I'll hand it back over to Fee. I think she'll talk a little bit more about next steps.
If you want, I'll just, before Fee starts, jumps in again, I might just answer Kathy's question about the EPBC Act as well. So the action that Andrew just mentioned is about trying to influence ending the logging that the New South Wales government controls. So that's one really important thing that you can do today if you are from New South Wales. But obviously, as Oisin pointed out, and others did, that really the forestry agreements that enable this logging shouldn't have ever been drafted up in the way they were in the first place. And that's a failure of our federal nature laws, which have been under review this year, and some legislation was passed, some bad legislation was passed through the House of Representatives in September, which would provide all environmental approval powers to the states. It'd be a real weakening of the laws. So, Kathy, specifically, so on your question in terms of what's happening in the Senate, so those laws have been listed to be debated on Thursday, listed for a second reading speech on Thursday next week. So the Places You Love Alliance, which BirdLife is also part of, which has been working on this issue, think that it's unlikely the laws will go through or be pushed through next week. A couple of crossbenchers have already made some pretty strong statements saying they won't pass it this week because next week they want to see more scrutiny. We think it'll probably come on for the last 2 weeks of the parliamentary sittings this year. So there'll be a lot to do. We'll be definitely coming back out to everybody with actions you can take to strengthen federal nature laws, which really, if we had stronger federal nature laws, then that would underpin all of the other protections as well. So a lot of work to do, but a lot of opportunities to make change as well.
Great, thanks, Erin. I'd also just see a comment from Paul there in the chat. Did you want to add?
Yeah, so in terms of those other, yes, there's a lot of bad stuff the New South Wales government's trying to get through at the moment. I know the EDO has been working a lot on those particular amendments as well. We don't have a specific action on that. We've sort of just focusing on forestry, but there's definitely if you've got the capacity to contact your local members about those amendments as well. The expansion of potential clearing that people can do in the guise of fire management. There's a lot of stuff going on.
Great, thank you, Erin. Thank you both. So there's a few things we can do there. Today, obviously, we're calling, I think I sent the link out to the call to action this week to people who had registered midweek. So I did get a few emails back from people letting us know that they'd already sent that letter to their local MPs. Our next action, once you've sent our call to action here through to your local MP, is to join us again on the 17th of November for a workshop on how to get a meeting with your MP. Like, we've heard from a lot of volunteers and locals when we've been out and about that you know, they run into their MPs all the time around the place, and they're able to get meetings with their MPs, but it's when it comes to, you know, being strategic. So we will also follow through with a briefing on some key points to take to your meetings with MPs. So that will be something we'll have a look at. For those of you who want to join us again on the 17th of November, we'll definitely follow up with the link to register for that workshop. But today, if you can jump on and go forward on that local action, that would be fantastic. Where are we going at time? We're at 12:56. So I'll follow. Oisin's waving. Are you waving goodbye, or do you have a question?
No. I just had a quick question. So, just in regards to call to action, on the website, so just to be clear, it's a call to action for your local federal MP about the EPBC things rather than the New South Wales MP Environment Minister.
Yes, that's right. So sorry, Andrew, you go.
I was just saying, the action for today for anyone that's in New South Wales would be to contact your New South Wales state MP. And there's a button at the bottom of that web page that goes to that New South Wales specific action. But I guess Aaron was saying anyone that's not New South Wales, or if you want to take an additional action, would be to email your federal MP about the EPBC amendments. So I'll
Okay,
put
thanks. I hadn't seen the button right at the bottom saying contact your New South Wales.
Here we go. I've just put the link in there. That's my mistake. When you were chatting before, I just put the link to our Swift Parrot page, and we do have the nature laws call to action on the home page of that Swift Parrot page. But there are boxes down the bottom. But I just put the link in the chat there that goes directly to your state MP call to action.
We can see we are, as Fee said, we are at time. I can see there's quite a few other questions. We might try to, because as Fee and I mentioned, we'll be sending a follow-up email with all of this info. So we might try to get to a couple of the other questions, put in a link to the lobbying section, and a little bit more about the EPBC stuff. I see someone's got a question about Samuel's final report. So perhaps if we can pull all that together, and we will answer some of that in the follow-up email. Maybe just one thing. Sorry, Fee, I know you want me to stop talking, but
no, that's fine. We've got 2 minutes. Go for it.
I see Paul said your local member lobbied for the amendments in the first place, and is unlikely to listen to you. I totally sympathise with people who don't have who have oppositional or antagonistic state MPs or federal MPs. I would just say it's still worth making the contact with them, because eventually this stuff does start to filter through to to the cabinet or the caucus or whatever sort of forum the politicians are in. So yeah, absolutely, you might not get a meeting with them, but it is still worth taking the action, because it is something that we can tend to do in the environment movement, is particularly with coalition governments, is they've said they're not going to do something, so then we stop contacting them. And for example, with the EPBC legislation, at some point the coalition's going to need to change their position, and they will need to make some compromises. So it's still worth putting pressure on them, even if they've made public statements saying that they have one position that we don't want them to have. So I will just let you know that even if it feels like it's not working, it can still be having an impact.
Thank you, Aaron. It's a slow process. Mick?
Yeah, I might make a quick comment. About 5 months ago, we managed to get a meeting with Minister Keane, myself, Sam Vine, our Conservation Manager, and Paul Sullivan, our CEO. Take away from this what you will. I mean, a politician is a politician, but Matt Keane did seem very interested in what we were saying. He seemed very supportive. He told us that he wanted to help us, but he was basically hamstrung because of the politics involved with Baralaro and all that. So I think there might be some willpower within the Environment Department on the state level to actually assist us with this. But we can't really play a part in the politics. But it's good to know that there is a politician that seems to be wanting to support what we're saying. So we maybe should try and capitalise on that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Mick. Thank you everyone for calling in today, and to all of our speakers and our locals, Jocelyn and Oisin. And it's great to see Harriet on the line again. Thank you to Mick and Deb for calling in also. It was great to have her come in yesterday. We will be in touch. We've got a few things to follow up with here in an email. The call to action, of course, you've seen in the drop in the chat here, but we'll follow through again. Call to action, our next meeting and workshop if you're keen to jump on there. We've got also, I really need to quickly flag that if have a look at our KBA program. I'll be following through it with a link to our KBA program. We are desperately looking for KBA guardians in the Ulladulla to Merimbula KBA, one of the areas most in need at the moment. It is a really big chunk of land, so we could also look at getting a few different few guardians in there. So we're open to having that conversation, but we'll give you an opportunity to follow through on that after the webinar also. So thank you so much everyone for joining. We appreciate your time and that you're our boots on the ground and we need you. So thank you so much for calling. If our staff and speakers can stay on the line for a little debrief, that would be awesome. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Fee.
Bye.